tutti.
Allora, buonasera, bentrovati. Siamo in un luogo fortemente simbolico perché è un luogo di pace. La campana dei caduti di Rovereto nasce certo alla fine delle guerre, mi viene da dire, ma è un luogo dove si media, dove le bandiere possono mettersi l'una vicina all'altra, dove non c'è una distinzione di colore, non c'è una distinzione di stati, c'è solo il desiderio di stare insieme. Allora, in un momento come questo nel quale tutti ci interroghiamo, e devo dire dopo giorni e giorni di guerra fioriscono anche le notizie false, fioriscono anche le notizie improprie. Io adesso salendo banalmente ero collegato su un canale importante della Radio Rai e si stava a disquisire su cosa sia un genocidio, quante persone si debbano ammazzare per arrivare al genocidio, come se invece fossimo di fronte a una festa di paese nella quale muore qualche persona. Cioè, voglio dire, siamo di fronte a un dramma che riguarda tutta l'umanità, siamo di fronte a un dramma che riguarda tutta l'Europa. Abbiamo la fortuna oggi di poter parlare con un professore universitario che ha dedicato tutta la sua vita di fatto a studiare non solo la Russia, ma anche, che è una cosa importantissima oggi, il rapporto fra la Russia e gli Stati Uniti, per cui ci sono più percezioni nel suo modo di leggere quello che sta accadendo. Del resto ancora nel 97 si chiedeva in un libro al professor Lynch: la Russia è un paese democratico. Insomma, penso che adesso possa aggiungere qualche pagina idealmente a quel libro. Però voi sapete che oggi siamo qui, certo che c'è il professor Lynch, anche per il bellissimo nesso con la Trentini nel mondo, perché il professor Lynch ha sposato una donna trentina del banale che è nata a New York ma che arriva dalle nostre terre. Anche questo è bello ricordarlo, perché c'è questo filo che lo riporta spesso in Italia, ci tornerà in un paio di occasioni anche nei prossimi mesi. Però, dato che oggi ci sono qui insieme, da una parte la Campana dei Caduti col suo reggente, l'ambasciatore Marco Marsigli, e dall'altra la Trentini nel mondo col suo presidente Maestri, io voglio dare subito la parola prima al reggente Marsilli e poi al presidente Maestri, anche per dare un senso al messaggio, da una parte di pace che dobbiamo mandare oggi e dall'altra invece di comprensione, perché abbiamo ancora bisogno di capire, molto bisogno di capire.
Grazie molte, direttore, per la bella introduzione che mi dà la possibilità di salutare tutto il pubblico presente, sia in sala sia quello collegato su YouTube, e soprattutto di ringraziare il professor Lynch per aver accettato l'invito congiunto dell'Associazione Trentini nel Mondo e della Fondazione Campana dei Caduti per questo evento che è sicuramente molto importante. Il dottor Faustini sottolineava come in una fase problematica come l'attuale le informazioni siano spesso distorte e come occorra rivolgersi a persone competenti per stabilire la verità e per dare un senso a quello che stiamo vivendo, che ovviamente è qualcosa di raccapricciante. Per cui io, professor Lynch, sono di nuovo molto contento che lei sia qui con noi. So che visiterà il Trentino in persona di qui a qualche mese e desidererei invitarla sin d'ora a visitare la Fondazione Campana dei Caduti quando ne avrà la possibilità, perché veramente è un qualcosa che per la pace, per la convivenza pacifica tra i popoli e per la fratellanza e i diritti dell'uomo è qualcosa di veramente, devo dire, notevole. Ecco, qua mi fermerei e darei la parola al dottor Maestri per la sua introduzione e il suo saluto.
Buonasera a tutti, anche da parte mia
Ha schiacciato, chiedo scusa.
Sì. Anche da parte mia un ringraziamento al professor Lynch per questa sua disponibilità che viene ancora più pesante e importante in un momento come quello contingente. Almeno più di 40 giorni è iniziata una cosa che non avremmo previsto, nessuno ha previsto, e che non sarebbe dovuta accadere. Ringrazio la disponibilità del reggente Marsilli della Campana. Noi abbiamo abbastanza consuetudine con la Fondazione Campana dei Caduti, che è simbolo della pace mondiale. Voglio dire, sul piazzale c'è sia la bandiera della Russia che quella dell'Ucraina e su questo non c'è dubbio sulla motivazione di questo. Ecco, io ho conosciuto Allen Lynch qualche anno fa in un rifugio in montagna, quindi in una situazione molto distesa. Ecco, per noi una persona che ha sposato una trentina è un trentino nel mondo, e quindi la nostra casa trentina è aperta ovviamente a lui. L'invito che l'ambasciatore ha posto è ovviamente una cosa da condividere, anche quello. Ecco, la nostra, come dire, azione in questo senso, che è rivolta a tutti i nostri associati nel mondo, ma anche agli altri, è di facilitare in qualche modo, e ringrazio di nuovo per la disponibilità il professor Lynch, facilitare questi incontri. L'abbiamo fatto in altri casi più fortuiti, ovviamente non così drammatici, ma sottoscrivo anch'io ciò che diceva Alberto Faustini prima, la necessità, e anche l'ambasciatore Marsilli, la necessità di un rigore scientifico nell'analizzare la situazione attuale, perché girano nel frullatore mediatico anche tante cose non veritiere e non giuste. Quindi a maggior ragione la disponibilità del professor Lynch è qui da noi valutata come molto importante. Credo che ora non ci sia altro da dire se non ascoltare ciò che ci dirà Allen Lynch. Grazie.
Grazie Presidente, grazie al Reggente. E tra l'altro avete di nuovo studiato l'importanza del valore scientifico di ciò che si dice. Va anche detto che il professor Lynch nella sua lunga attività universitaria ha anche a lungo seguito proprio il tema attraverso una fondazione delle borse di studio e dottorati di ricerca, per cui ha molto aiutato anche i giovani a studiare di più e avere gli strumenti per capire il mondo. Prima di dargli la parola saluto solo le persone che ci seguono non solo in sala ma anche grazie al web su YouTube, e adesso do la parola al professor Lynch per quella che io considero una lectio magistralis per noi privilegiati che possiamo ascoltarlo rispetto ai temi del giorno. Prego, professor Lynch.
Thank you very much, egregio signor Faustini, egregio Presidente Maestre, egregio signor Massili, signori, signore, amici e parente. And amongst the parente, I must include Professor Mariano Anderle, who married a cousin of my wife from Giudicaria, and who played a signal role in bringing this event to fruition. So thank you very much. And I also want to thank la Fondazione Campana dei Caduti and l'Associazione Trentini nel Mondo, my late mother-in-law, also from Giudicaria, would receive the journal Trentini nel Mondo every month, and she was very happy to maintain this connection back with her home country. And I will also tell you about the Campana dei Caduti in Rovereto. My wife Tulia brings American tourists every year to Italy, to the Trentino, and she makes a point of bringing them to the Campana dei Caduti, and it's a central part of her tours, and it's a very moving event for them. All right, so before I begin my lecture proper, note the map behind me, which I believe you can see. And this is a map of the Austro-Hungarian Empire in 1914 on the eve of the First World War. And so simply to note the connection between Trentino, what's today Trentino, and the war that is currently taking place in Ukraine. So of course you all know that Trentino was at that point until 1918 part of the Austrian Empire, but also what is today Western Ukraine, Galicia, was part of the Austrian Empire too. And how many thousands of sons of Trentino were conscripted into the Austrian army and sent to faraway Galicia in order to fight the war between Austria and Russia there, and how many thousands lost their lives, which are also recorded and commemorated by the Fondazione Campana dei Caduti. That includes my wife's own grandfather, who had a very, very difficult battlefield experience, as did so many thousands of other sons of Trentino. So this is simply to underscore the bonds that connect Europe during this guerra horribilis, this horrible war that is taking place today. All right, so now here are my remarks. First, how do we explain the fact of this war and why did it happen now? And I believe, while there are many factors that can be identified, there are three that are the most important, what I call vectors that converged to launch this war that Russia began by invading Ukraine on February 24th of this year. The three vectors are a colonialist vector, which is a Russian vector. Most Americans will agree with that one. The second vector, however, is a maximalist American vector, which very few in the United States support. And the third vector is a Ukrainian vector, an internal Ukrainian, an ethno-nationalist vector. And I want to argue that it is the convergence of all three of these vectors, Russian colonialist, American maximalist, and Ukrainian ethno-nationalist, that framed the decision, the awful, tragic decision that Vladimir Putin took to invade Ukraine and begin this war, which is now in the middle of its second month. Briefly, on the Russian colonialist vector, this is a point of view that sees Ukraine as both something artificial, not real, and also as a threat to Russia. A threat to Russia, both as a great power, but also to Russia's identity as a state and as an integral culture. In 2008, at a NATO summit meeting in Bucharest, Romania, Putin told President Bush at that time, you know, George, Ukraine is simply not a real country. And that's been a consistent Russian view, even long before the Putin period of time. It is reflected also in a remark that I heard myself, a senior advisor to Putin, make in 2011. It was at a conference in China. And he said, to the shock of his Chinese hosts, he said, thank God for the Russian-Georgian War. That's the 5-day war between Georgia, post-Soviet Georgia, and Russia in August of 2008. Everyone was shocked. And then he went on, yes, thank God for the Russian-Georgian War, because it means there will not be a Russian-Ukrainian war. So from the Russian point of view, the 5-day war against Georgia in 2008 was meant to send a message to the NATO countries. This is a red line. This is too close to Russia. In fact, the Russian speaker, who was head of the Russian Presidential Council on Foreign Policy at that time, he said, Georgia was a red line for us, but if Georgia was a red line, Ukraine was a triple red line. So this encapsulates the Russian colonialist vector, but I want to say that colonialist vector has been constant throughout the past 30 years, since the disintegration of the Soviet Union. Therefore, that vector alone cannot explain this war. If that's been present all this time, something else must have interacted with it in order to produce the war. Here we come to the second vector, what I call the American maximalist vector. And this is one that has tried to deny Russia a sphere of influence along its historical borderlands, the borderlands of both the Soviet Union and also of the Russian Empire before that. In other words, to deny Russia exactly what the United States demands for itself in the Western Hemisphere. And almost every American has forgotten that in 1989, 1 month after the Berlin Wall came down, and 1 week after the first President Bush met with Gorbachev at Malta to declare the end of the Cold War, the United States invaded Panama with thousands of troops, in effect reinforcing the Monroe Doctrine as understood by the United States and reinforcing the American insistence on its own exclusive sphere of influence in the Western Hemisphere. The Americans have been quite determined to deny that to Russia, and that is a significant accelerating element in the path toward war here. I won't go into too many details, time is short. I will only mention the treaty signed between Ukraine and the United States on November 10th of last year, November 10th, 2021. This was entitled the American-Ukrainian Charter on Strategic Partnership. And I'll just quote here from items 5 and 6. Quote, item 5, the United States remains committed to assisting Ukraine with ongoing defense and security reforms and to continuing its robust training and exercises. Let me just add to that, in 2021, the United States and NATO conducted 6 naval exercises in the Black Sea near the Crimean Peninsula. The charter goes on to state, the United States supports Ukraine's efforts to maximize its status as a NATO enhanced opportunities partner to promote interoperability. What interoperability means is that the weapons that Ukraine uses are compatible with the weapons that NATO uses. The communication systems that Ukraine uses are compatible with NATO's communication system. The transportation systems are interoperable. In other words, that Ukraine was on the path, if not becoming a formal member of NATO, of becoming an associated partner, strategic partner, increasingly integrated into NATO security structures. Just 1 second. Point 6. Ukraine intends to continue to advance democratic civilian control of the military, to reform its security service, and here's the key point, to modernize its defense acquisition processes, to advance its Euro-Atlantic aspirations. I want to repeat that, to advance its Euro-Atlantic aspirations. That is to say, to become increasingly integrated into NATO security practices and even institutions. This was the culminating instance of a process that had been going on for a number of years, really beginning slowly in 2004, as the Americans and their European allies helped to basically overturn an election in Ukraine to the detriment of Putin's candidate at that time, and accelerating after the annexation of Crimea in 2014. So this is basically the second vector that I want to talk about, which was increasing in recent years. It was not a constant. It was present since the mid-2000s, but accelerating especially after 2014. And I think it was punctuated by this US-Ukraine Charter of Partnership in November of last year. The third vector is a Ukrainian internal vector, what I call an ethno-nationalist vector, one that tries to eliminate Russian cultural and linguistic, and also by extension, political influence in Ukraine by consolidating Ukraine anchored in Euro-Atlantic institutions rather than in Euro-Asian institutions, which of course would mean dominated by Russia. Recent efforts by the Zelensky government last year to further diminish the status of Russian as an official language in Ukraine, continued efforts that had begun already in 2014. And I should note that back in 2014, among the very first acts of the new Ukrainian government that came to power with substantial American assistance after the collapse of the preceding, more or less pro-Russian Yanukovych government, their first act practically was to eliminate the official and protected status of Russian as a second official language of Ukraine, which went far to stimulating the rebellion backed by Russia in the eastern provinces. Those provinces remain at play now between Russia and Ukraine to the present day. By the middle of 2021, I argue, the intersection of these three vectors, Russian colonialist, American maximalist, and Ukrainian ethno-nationalist, combined to persuade Putin that it was no longer possible to reconcile Ukraine's formal sovereignty, its formal independence, with Russia's core strategic interests as Russia, as Putin defined those interests for Russia. That the Americans were simply unwilling to concede a distinctive Russian sphere of influence along Russia's most sensitive Western borderlands with Ukraine, and that Ukraine would have to be compelled by force of arms to accept Moscow's agenda. That, to me, frames the decision for the current war. That's the first part. The second part is how, before we get to the diplomatic proposals, how do we, what conclusions can we draw from the course of fighting over the past 6 weeks? There are certain conclusions that I believe we can draw with a high degree of confidence. First, that the Russian leadership was simply unprepared for a war of this intensity. Putin expected that a show of force would be enough to induce the Ukrainians to capitulate and to allow him to install a quisling or puppet government in Kiev that would formalize Ukraine's status as a Russian vassal state. Instead, as we've all seen, Putin has discovered that Ukraine is in fact a real nation and that it will not accept rule from Moscow either directly or indirectly. Secondly, that Russia has the capacity to destroy almost anything that it wants in Ukraine. But at the same time, it does not have the capacity to eliminate Ukrainian resistance, not to mention to militarily occupy and govern Ukraine, a country, by the way, the size of France, with a pre-war population of almost 44 million people. Moreover, in spite of Russia's overall superiority in population and armed forces, in terms of the forces that are deployed in Ukraine, there is relative parity or equality on the battlefield. And that means, given the historic fact that decisive operations on the offense usually require a superiority of 4 or 5 to 1, and much higher in urban combat, it means that the Russians simply do not have the capacity and manpower in order to achieve a decisive victory through most of Ukraine, which was clearly their objective at the beginning of the fighting. So Russia can destroy, but it cannot govern. Third, with Ukraine having a land border of about 1,500 kilometers with 4 NATO countries, that is to say, today, Poland, Hungary, Slovakia, and Romania. And much of that area is mountainous in the Carpathian Mountains. Russia does not have the possibility of stopping substantially the supply of weapons, especially portable, small-scale, handheld anti-tank and anti-aircraft weapons that so far have played a major role in frustrating Russia's military ambitions in Ukraine. Fourth, the longer this war goes on, the more difficult it will be for Putin to hide the costs of the war from the Russian people, who in fact actually tend toward pacifism, given their history of the Second World War, given the history of the Soviet war in Afghanistan in the 1980s. In fact, it's because of the deep roots of Russian pacifism that Russian censorship is so strict today, because Putin knows that the population learned the actual truth of what was taking place in Ukraine, as opposed to the highly selective picture that's being broadcast in Russia. It could lead to widespread upheaval and resistance to his regime. You cannot, after all, censor the burial of thousands of Russian sons. Fifth, on the Ukrainian side, it is now clear that Ukraine will not be joining the European Union in any immediate or medium-term future, and that it will certainly not, if ever, be joining NATO. President Biden made this plain even before the war began, when he stated publicly that under no circumstances would American soldiers be fighting Russian soldiers in Ukraine. He reinforced this point in the middle of the war on March 4th, and it was confirmed at a NATO summit meeting that NATO would not be providing a no-fly defensive aerial zone over Ukraine because precisely it would entail the risk of war with Russia. So in effect, Ukraine was never a vital interest vital for life. A vital interest is an interest that you're willing to go to war for. Ukraine was never such an interest for the United States. It was always such an interest for Russia. And in this respect, I have to say, while of course Putin bears primary responsibility for this war by launching the invasion, the United States also bears very significant responsibility. Since 2008, the United States through NATO has promised Ukraine admission into NATO, but without ever doing anything practical to make that likely. In fact, the reason is the Germans and French, amongst others, were opposed to bringing Ukraine into NATO precisely out of the fear it would be recklessly provocative to Russia. So in effect, for almost 15 years, NATO's formal policy was to encourage Ukraine to join NATO, but without any realistic chances of doing so. This also helped to increasingly radicalize internal Ukrainian politics and resulted in a decision in Moscow that frankly was predictable by anybody following Russian politics closely over the past 10 to 15 years, that Ukraine in NATO indeed was a triple red line for Moscow. Point 6, the Ukrainian military, with prolonged support from NATO, may well be able to avoid defeat. But at the same time, no matter how much assistance it gets from NATO, it cannot force a surrender or a defeat on the part of the Russian army itself, so long as the Russian army and the Russian government is willing to absorb the costs of waging war in Ukraine. Point 7, it is an irony, a stupendous irony, that after 6 weeks of war, Vladimir Putin, who clearly was hoping for the overthrow of Zelensky in the first days of the war, Putin now has an objective interest in keeping Zelensky in power in Kiev. Why? If he wants to end this war, and all wars end, and they almost always end by negotiation, rather than the physical elimination of the enemy, he has to negotiate it with someone who can enforce the agreement inside of his own country. And right now, I don't think there is any other politician in Kiev with the popular support that Zelensky has, about 90%, 90%, or with the willingness to compromise with Russia. A willingness that just yesterday he repeated, in spite of all of the combat losses, all of the destruction and atrocities, he certainly more than any other American leader that I've seen is deeply conscious that in the end, he cannot substitute Washington for Moscow in Ukraine's international orientation. And some such a peace settlement implying some difficult and serious compromises will be necessary. Putin, in other words, needs Zelensky if he wants to find a way to stop this war without Russia being consumed in the process. Finally, point 8, the Americans also have a fundamental choice to make. Is there interest in promoting stability in relations between Ukraine and Russia? Or is it rather to bleed Russia white over the ruin of Ukraine? I think the answer is unclear about that at this point. To give one example, on the question of sanctions, in the United States today, the general attitude is sanctions against Russia, economic and financial, will remain in place so long as Putin is in power. In other words, not necessarily if this war ends, not necessarily if Russian troops evacuate Ukraine, but so long as Putin is in power. And by referring to Putin publicly as a war criminal, which the president of the United States did, in effect, the United States is implicitly stating it's not that interested in a negotiated solution. I would note that even during World War II, when the United States and Britain and the Soviet Union made a commitment to war crimes tribunals after the war, they did not name any particular German leaders, right? Knowing that that would vastly complicate the process of ending the war itself. All right, so that's how I interpret the state of the war to date. If Moscow and Kiev, as well as Washington, truly desire peace, I believe there is no shortage of diplomatic instruments that could help to bring it about. And I will detail them in just 1 minute. But it remains a brutal historical truth that negotiations for peace tend to begin seriously only when both parties believe what I call the certain future costs, the certain future losses are much higher than the uncertain benefits of difficult compromises. I'm going to repeat that because it's a complex formulation. Peace negotiations tend to begin seriously when each side believes, finally, the future certain costs of continuing the war are much higher than the uncertain benefits of the difficult compromises that have to be reached in order to end the war. That is a process that often takes years to reach, as the history of the Korean War, the American War in Vietnam, the Soviet War in Afghanistan, amongst many others, shows. But if the political will is there, and I think right now, this is 6 weeks of war. This is like the middle of September, 1914. Imagine how different the rest of the 20th century would have been had the First World War ended with the status quo on the battlefield of mid-September 1914. I believe that Russia and Ukraine do have an objective interest in settling this war sooner rather than later. The problem is war tends to generate its own logic, its own awful momentum, and it makes it more and more, it tends to accelerate polarization and extremes. So the proposals that I'm about to make are in principle practical, but they require a great deal of difficult political compromise in Kiev, in Moscow, in Washington, and in NATO. An essential precondition for these negotiations, of course, is the military condition on the battlefield. And clearly, the Ukrainian ability to withstand the Russian assault on Kiev has played a major role in whatever reevaluation may be taking place in Moscow, but also in Kiev. Putin never expected a war of this duration. The Russian military was clearly not prepared for it. After about 3 weeks of this war, Putin stated publicly in March that he would be prepared to end the war under 3 conditions. Number 1, that Ukraine adopt a position of neutrality in international relations. Number 2, that Ukraine recognize the independence, that is the sovereignty of Russia in Crimea. And third, that Ukraine acknowledge the independence of the far eastern provinces of Luhansk and Donetsk. In other words, that was the status quo before the war began, the status quo antebellum. Zelensky has indicated that he's prepared to move on all 3 of those positions. He has accepted the idea that Ukraine should be neutral and not part of the NATO alliance. By the way, notice that also means that Ukraine would not be part of a Russian alliance either, something that tends to be overlooked, certainly in NATO circles and especially in Washington, D.C. He has also indicated that there will be difficult and painful territorial compromises to make with respect to Crimea and with respect to the 2 eastern provinces. He is one of the few Ukrainian politicians who have spoken like this. And given his currently enormous popularity as a wartime leader, there probably are very few in Ukraine who might be capable of actually executing that possibility. So I'm suggesting that there are objectively available circumstances for the kind of diplomatic framework that I will now summarize. So the 9 steps toward a diplomatic solution. Number 1, given the fact, as I've just noted, that President Zelensky has accepted the idea that Ukraine should be a neutral state for the long foreseeable future, that's the central Russian condition for the war. Or let's put it this way. If it is, in fact, the central Russian condition for the war, then there's no reason for this war to continue any further. There should be an immediate ceasefire while negotiations take place over a whole range of very difficult and contentious issues. If, in fact, Ukraine's neutral status is the central object of this negotiation, of this war, as opposed to the elimination of Ukraine's true sovereignty. I would propose an immediate ceasefire pending negotiations, and that ceasefire line can be patrolled and observed and monitored by troops from the United Nations, from other neutral countries. Point 2, on the territorial issues, which are probably the most difficult ones. Ukraine should agree to accept whatever status voters in Crimea and the eastern provinces want, so long as the election is carried out under United Nations auspices and not Russian auspices. Refugees from the region should be allowed to return before the vote, and the regions in the far east of Luhansk and Donbass should be defined by the lines that existed before the Russian invasion of February 24th. Third, Ukraine and Russia should agree to a, excuse me, a demilitarized zone, say of 100 kilometers on both sides of the Russian-Ukrainian border. And now we have to add the Belarusian border as well, since Belarus was a staging area for the invasion of Kiev, of Ukraine from the north. A demilitarized zone on both sides of the border, which can be supplemented by what are called confidence-building measures. These are based on Cold War agreements. They can include things like limitations on the number of troops that can be moved in these areas, on-site inspection or aerial inspection of these limitations, notification ahead of time of troop movements in the area. There are a range of technical possibilities that could be used if the political will is there. Point 4, and by the way, those zones could also be monitored by United Nations peacekeeping forces. Point 4, and I think this, I have not heard anyone else speak about this. I call it conditional neutrality, because we have to find a way in which Russia and Ukraine's partners in NATO can agree to the formula. Conditional neutrality. That is to say, Ukraine agrees to remain neutral so long as Russia observes the conditions of the demilitarized zone. In other words, so long as there are not the massive concentrations of force that we saw in the past year, and of course, so long as Russia accepts the territorial integrity of Ukraine as defined in an eventual peace settlement. Such conditional neutrality could be incorporated into the Ukrainian constitution. That has been a Russian demand, that the Ukrainian constitution should be changed from aspirations to NATO membership to commitment to neutrality. It would be hard for me to see how Ukraine could accept an unconditional neutrality in a demilitarized form, but a conditional neutrality dependent on Russian actions, it seems to me, is politically much more viable. Fifth element of a diplomatic solution. The United States and NATO on their side agree not to deploy certain categories of offensive strike weapons, especially weapons with nuclear capabilities, in Ukraine. This could be followed up by a new European NATO-Russia arms control agreement, limiting or even abolishing the deployment of medium-range nuclear missiles in Europe. This is a point that the Russian government stated that it was open to on March 11th. Sixth, the situation of Finland and Sweden in Scandinavia. Right now, there is a movement, especially in Finland, to join NATO rapidly. This is completely understandable. I think it would be much more useful if Finland and Sweden were to be included in this peace agreement as among the co-guarantors of the Armistice and Peace Treaty, making it clear that their future attitude toward NATO membership would be strongly influenced by the extent to which both Russia and Ukraine observe the terms of the peace settlement. I think it is much more useful for Sweden and Finland to remain out of NATO if that absence can be used to induce the conclusion and observance of a peace settlement than it is for them to simply join NATO as such. Point 7, and this is a point where a lot of difficult decisions will have to be taken in Washington, D.C. Once Russian troops have withdrawn from Ukraine or have withdrawn from the boundaries that are agreed upon in the peace settlement, then NATO will lift all of its economic and financial sanctions in place against Russia since the Russian annexation of Crimea in 2014. Point 8, while these negotiations are taking place, United Nations observers will be sent to monitor humanitarian corridors for the return of refugees, for the delivery of emergency medical supplies, clothing, food, shelter, etc. And the last point, which will no doubt be very difficult for Russia to swallow. there will have to be substantial financing for the reconstruction of Ukraine, to which, if we involve the United Nations, Russia inevitably must pay part, given its contribution to the general UN budget. But I think it is also both fair and realistic to assume that Russia's financial assets that are currently frozen in the Western world, more than $300 billion worth, much to the shock of the Russian government, that those assets can be unfrozen in proportion to Russian contributions to the reconstruction of Ukraine, which I'm sure will have to be made indirectly as contributions to a United Nations Reconstruction Fund. So those are my 9 steps. Assuming the political will exists, these are all steps that have been part of various diplomatic settlements of wars in the past, Cold War, pre-Cold War, post-Cold War. But in the absence of the political will to reach some such settlement in Russia, in Ukraine, and in the United States, in the absence of such will to explore terms of a settlement, then the prospect for the indefinite future is of a long-term, what amounts to a proxy war, an indirect war between Russia and NATO over Ukraine, during which Ukraine gets progressively destroyed. The weakness of the Russian armed forces continues to be demonstrated, much to the joy of American military intelligence and the embarrassment of Russia's position as a great power. And it also, by the way, maintains the risk of a nuclear confrontation at some point between Russia and the West over Ukraine. I cannot say that that risk is very high. I can say with absolute certainty it is higher than it would be if there were no such war in the first place. Let me close with the following historical reference. In the year 1900, so 122 years ago, the Russian Minister of War, a gentleman by the name of Alexei Kuropatkin, he wrote a memorandum to Emperor Nicholas II on Russia's strategic situation. And now here, this map comes into play. So here's the Russian Empire. Next to it is the Austrian Empire, and Galicia, or today's Western Ukraine, is in contention. Russia, Kuropatkin wrote, the emperor, had nothing to gain from war. It had nothing to gain even in victory in war. Why? Kuropatkin explained, in the event that Russia should defeat Austria, Russia would be compelled to annex the province of Galicia into the Russian Empire. That territory was populated by Ukrainians who had never been part of a Moscow polity or empire, and which looked toward Warsaw, Vienna, even Rome, a substantial Catholic population, for its cultural, legal, social, and even religious points of reference. The Galician Slavs, Kuropatkin told the emperor, had no desire to become Russian subjects and instead wished to establish independent states. He concluded, were Russia ever to acquire Galicia in a victorious war against Austria, quote, it would become an Alsace-Lorraine, providing a constant pretext for the renewal of hostilities. 1900. Today, I believe Kuropatkin's analysis can be extended to almost all of Ukraine. This war has demonstrated that Russia is simply not welcome in most parts of Ukraine, the overwhelming majority, even those areas that are predominantly populated either by ethnic Russians or Russophones, that is to say, ethnic Ukrainians who speak Russian as their primary language. based upon my analysis of the war that I've explained to you, Russia today cannot afford defeat, but it also cannot afford victory. And I think the same is true of Ukraine. Hopefully, the governments of the United States and of NATO realize this and are prepared to act accordingly. That is to say, to act for peace. I end with a rephrasing of an ancient Latin expression in this place, and it is, si vis pacem, para pacem. Si vis pacem, para pacem. If you wish peace, prepare for peace. Thank you very much.
Grazie professor Lynch, solo due chiarimenti prima di passare la parola all'ambasciatore, che so che voleva chiedere a sua volta alcune cose, e a chi ci sta ascoltando. Le faccio due domande in una. Una è: se fosse durata 5 giorni come in Georgia e come Putin auspicava questa guerra, gli Stati Uniti e l'Europa avrebbero chiuso un occhio? E la seconda, c'è anche lo scenario possibile su un golpe o comunque un cambiamento in Russia, cioè una destituzione di Putin? Questo potrebbe cambiare le cose?
Okay, thank you. I think we do know what would have happened if the war had lasted just 5 days or so. In other words, if the war had gone according to the original plan. And it is proven by the fact that President Biden actually offered asylum for President Zelensky. The Americans offered to transport Zelensky either out of Ukraine or to far western Ukraine to, in effect, set up a government in exile. In other words, a quick, rapid, decisive war would have led to the Russian occupation of probably at least the eastern half of Ukraine. But I don't think it would have decided the outcome of the war. In other words, the Ukrainian population would not have accepted that as a final solution. And it would have led to a long, drawn-out, inconclusive struggle in which Western Ukraine would become the staging ground for an interminable war of resistance, guerrilla infiltration, etc., against Russia. That, frankly, is why many of us did not think that Putin would take a decision to invade Ukraine in this way. He had that decision back in 2014 in the southeastern provinces of Ukraine, and in the end, he hesitated to do it because he would be, in effect, creating his own Vietnam on his most sensitive western borderland. But in a 5-day war, I think definitely the US and NATO would have accepted the reality. They were prepared for a limited invasion and limited sanctions. After all, how could the Germans have put their second pipeline in the Baltic Sea into abeyance? They never anticipated an invasion like this. Only an invasion like this could have done it. So I think we would have had a rather different outcome. On the question of an internal coup d'etat against Putin, number one, keep in mind that Putin has populated his regime with like-minded people, especially from the security services, but also from the military and other paramilitary services. And these are allies who have profited personally, enormously, right, from Putin's government. So we have to look for signs of a split or a division within these elites. So far, I don't see those kinds of signs. I do know that there are significant differences in broader political circles in Moscow about the cost of this war, about the wisdom of continuing it. I myself was interviewed on Russian television on March 25th, and they included, I made statements very similar to this. and they included them. The Russian translation was perfect. There was no distortion. And they included my comment about Putin needing Zelensky. So, and I have other evidence, but those are not part of the sanctum sanctorum, the inner sanctum. They're part of the outer sanctum. I think the resistance is more likely to come from the colonels rather than the generals. In other words, the officers who are actually responsible for fighting the war on the ground and not for managing Kremlin politics in Moscow. But so therefore, I mean, if Putin is prudent enough, he will try to find a way to stop this war too. But so that's where I would look for. I would not look for the top level of Kremlin politics. I would look for some kind of revolt of the colonels based upon increasingly disastrous military outcomes. Of the kind, by the way, that led to the resignation of Nicholas II in 1917. Abdication.
Grazie direttore, e vorrei congratularmi con il professor Lynch per una esposizione davvero magistrale, ricca di tantissimi spunti sui quali riflettere a lungo anche nel corso poi della serata. Da parte mia solo un'osservazione, nel senso che non sarei così convinto che l'Ucraina non approdi alla fine nell'Unione Europea, secondo il principio meno NATO e più Unione Europea, appunto. Si tratterebbe chiaramente di una decisione politica densa di conseguenze, perché noi sappiamo che l'Ucraina non riveste nessuno dei criteri di Copenaghen dal punto di vista economico, politico e sociale per entrare a far parte della famiglia europea. Però di fronte a una situazione di questo genere, di fronte ai desiderata anche del nostro Parlamento europeo, delle visite della signora von der Leyen, credo che ci potrebbe essere una comunis opinio favorevole a questo sviluppo. Come dico, sviluppo non privo di conseguenze, perché pensiamo ad esempio ai numerosi piccoli paesi balcanici, dall'Albania al Montenegro, alla Bosnia, eccetera, che attendono in fila pazientemente da anni, con situazioni interne decisamente più semplici, se non altro per la ridotta popolazione, rispetto ad accogliere 44 milioni di persone in seno all'Unione Europea. Questa è una osservazione alla quale vorrei fare seguire invece una domanda, alla quale devo dire il professor Lynch ha in parte già risposto, ma mi interessa comunque una sua approfondimento. È riconosciuto che la dottrina filosofica, chiamiamola così, di Putin, la sua visione geostrategica, dati del 2007 dal discorso da lui svolto alla Wehrkunde di Monaco di Baviera, in base alla quale 3 sono i pilastri da lui elucidati per spiegare il fondamento del pensiero geostrategico russo. I tre pilastri sono la fine dell'unipolarismo rappresentato da Stati Uniti e Occidente in generale, a favore di un mondo multipolare nel quale i paesi emergenti o già emersi come India, Russia stessa, chiaramente Cina, Sudafrica, abbiano sul piano delle decisioni pari importanza e pari dignità. Il secondo punto è rappresentato dalla concentrazione nel foro delle Nazioni Unite di tutte le problematiche della pace e della sicurezza, ad esclusione pertanto di altri, sulla base chiaramente una identificazione, come potrei dire, interessata, dal momento che, come sappiamo, a New York la Russia possiede il diritto di veto. Terzo punto, l'impegno della NATO a non estendere verso est le proprie frontiere, dopo che nel 2005, cioè solo 2 anni prima, era avvenuto il più ampio processo di inclusione di nuovi membri nella NATO, ben 7, tra cui i 3 paesi baltici che, come sappiamo, appartenevano all'Unione Sovietica. Allora, questo avveniva nel 2007 e nel 2008 2 fattori, secondo me, importanti si verificavano. Nel vertice NATO di Bucarest la NATO prevedeva per l'Ucraina la possibilità di accedere all'Alleanza Atlantica, ovviamente qualora determinate circostanze fossero presenti, che non erano presenti, che non sono presenti nemmeno ora, ma insomma in linea di principio questa possibilità, questo sviluppo non veniva escluso. E il secondo aspetto, già ricordato dal professor il Lynch, l'invasione russa della appunto Georgia, che poi avrebbe dato la stura ad un'altra serie di interventi purtroppo ai quali stiamo assistendo ora. La mia domanda, vengo al punto, è la seguente. Secondo lei, professore, c'è qualcosa che l'Occidente, intendendo con Occidente sia gli Stati Uniti che l'Unione Europea, avrebbe potuto fare dal 2008 al 2022 per impedire questa carneficina, questo scempio al quale stiamo assistendo, oppure l'Occidente può comunque ritenersi, come posso dire, soddisfatto di quanto fatto e imputare alla imprevedibilità e al cinismo dell'attuale nuovo zar quanto sta succedendo? Grazie.
Thank you very much for those comments and thoughts and questions. On the first point about the likelihood of Ukrainian accession to the European Union, I would also note that Turkey has been on the list for a very long time. So I'm not going to argue your point that it may eventually happen. And there may have been a reevaluation in Brussels about the likelihood and time frame in Ukraine joining the EU as opposed to NATO. But my point for this lecture is that Ukraine's relationship to the EU cannot matter fundamentally in the time frame involved in this war. That's the first point. All right. I think actually inevitably Putin's decisions are in the long term moving Kiev toward Brussels and away from Moscow. All right. Whatever the formal status of Ukraine with respect to the European Union is. Just imagine a post-war outcome where neither Russia nor Ukraine wins decisively. Inevitably, Russia is not going to be paying decisively for the reconstruction of Ukraine directly. Probably it'll be various European Union programs. And inevitably, Ukraine is going to be modernized, all right, by being increasingly integrated into European Union-wide structures. So I'll accept that point, but my main point was Brussels, either in the EU forum or in the NATO forum, cannot be a substitute for Ukraine's security requirements in the policy relevant future described by this war. That's the first point. The second question, what could NATO or the West have done since 2008? I'm going to come back to the European Union again, because I do believe the Americans bear, and I have stated already in my talk, the Americans bear very substantial responsibility, in my judgment, not just political, but also moral and ethical, for making promises to Ukraine that in fact they had no intention of keeping, as we also did with Georgia, incidentally. But if we look at the course of negotiations between the European Union and Ukraine in 2013, what we see is a standard pattern of, this was in terms of the association agreement. It was a bilateral thing between Brussels and Kiev. The Russians repeatedly requested, demanded of Brussels, look, our two economies are so closely intertwined, and the ramifications of Ukraine joining, getting close to the EU are so profound for the Russian economy that you have to include Russia in these negotiations somehow. And the European Union rejected repeatedly and explicitly Russia's entreaties, Russia's requests, arguing, no, this all doesn't concern Russia. It's just a bilateral issue between Ukraine and Brussels, EU bureaucracy. You may remember that in the summer of that year, Russia embargoed the export of most Ukrainian items to Russia. as a sign of its position. As far as I can tell, there was no significant reaction to that, either in Brussels or in Washington. Again, we're ignoring another red line in Moscow. So my answer to your question, to try and be direct, it's going to be a more general answer, because I think the fundamental objection that Putin has, and you alluded to it, Mr. Ambassador, in your reference to his Munich speech in 2007, is that after 1991, the United States and NATO constructed a post-Cold War security order in Europe, whatever its benefits, with Russia on the outside. It excluded Russia. In the 90s, the Clinton administration's position was, in effect, well, Russia is so weak and so dependent on us that what they think really doesn't matter. So NATO expansion, 2 wars in Bosnia, another one in Kosovo, against overwhelming Russian objection. And it seemed that history was working out that way. And we know it didn't quite work out that way. Russia had remarkable capacity for recuperation, as it did after the Civil War in 1920, as it did after the time of troubles, 1613, as it has repeatedly shown throughout its history. So it would have required, in other words, it would have required acts of restraint on the part of Washington and Brussels to accept less than what their actual power capabilities at that time allowed. It would have required maybe working through the Organization on Security and Cooperation in Europe. It would have meant maybe emphasizing the European Union over NATO, but it would have meant bringing Russia in somehow, and that was always unacceptable to the United States. And as the negotiations between Brussels and Kiev show in 2013, it was also unacceptable in the European Union.
Grazie. C'è forse ancora lo spazio per una domanda, perché poi ci si sposta verso la campana per ascoltarne i rintocchi. Dico anche a chi ci sta seguendo su YouTube che arriverà a tutti loro un link al quale potranno seguire in diretta il suono della campana. Chiedo a voi se ci sono domande in sala. Adesso facciamo un esperimento, vi chiedo di parlare a voce molto alta, nel silenzio assoluto vediamo se il professore la sente, se no allora sì, sarebbe la cosa migliore, grazie. Il Presidente Maestri ha già girato il microfono, per cui prego.
Sono Mariano Andel, ne approfitto per salutare Ale. Ciao Ale.
C'è risparmio su una telefonata praticamente.
Io ad Ale volevo chiedere questo. Quando tu parli dei 3 vettori, hai fatto quasi tutto il tuo talk senza mai nominare il ruolo della Comunità Europea. Cioè, tutti vogliono correre dentro l'Unione Europea, ma diciamo in questa lotta strategica per la divisione del mondo, io la chiamo così, scusate, la Comunità Europea sembra assente, sembra incapace di dettare delle proprie linee. Quanto è vero quello che sto dicendo?
Prego, professore.
Well, as I just noted in my reply to the ambassador, in 2013, the European Union was acting as a unified actor in the negotiations for an association agreement with Ukraine. I have my criticisms of that, of the strategy and tactics, but they were definitely acting as a unified actor. It's true the European Union is not the equivalent or even close equivalent, not just of the United States or of NATO in military terms, but even of individual countries like France or Germany or Britain or even Italy in military security terms. But within its sphere, especially within the economic sphere, social cultural sphere, the European Union has been able to have significant influence on states wishing to join it. For example, in the 1990s, the 3 Baltic states of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, especially in Estonia, Estonians passed a language law similar to what the Ukrainians have been doing since 2014, to basically downgrade, if not eliminate, the status of the Russian language in Estonia. Now, I understand why they did this, but they still had a very significant Russian population. And the European Union intervened to state that if you wish to join the European Union, you're going to have to change those laws to conform with European Union standards of civil rights and language rights and so forth. And you know what? The Estonians did it because they valued the benefits of European Union membership so much. What I find fault, not just with the European Union as an actor, but also the United States and NATO as an actor, is it's not simply that we've pressed Russia too hard. We've asked too little of the government in Kiev over the years, as far as trying to find compromises rather than maximal solutions to internal Ukrainian problems. And in the process, I think we have probably unintentionally encouraged more extremism, more polarization, and thus propelling that third vector, the Ukrainian ethno-nationalist vector. But I see within its sphere, the European Union is capable of acting as a unified actor and has acted so in ways that could have been applicable to the current situation. Ahimè, alas.
Grazie professore. In chiusura le vorrei solo chiedere, prima di spostarci appunto la campana che rintocca per la pace, cosa dobbiamo augurarci? Cioè lei ha elencato diversi punti, ma visto da noi, visto dall'Italia, visto dall'Europa, cosa ci conviene di più? Uso una parola sapendone il peso.
I think the next 2 weeks or so are going to be a very important window. It's going to take time for the Russians to reorganize their armed forces effectively for the kind of large-scale war they say they are planning in the East. It's going to take time for the Ukrainians to re-equip themselves. Their losses must have been massive as well. Of course, it's not in their interest to talk about them. But I think after a 2 or 3 week period, there's going to be a resumption of a large-scale war in the East with completely unpredictable consequences. It could result in a World War I type of stalemate, static lines, massive long-range destruction by artillery, or because of the geography of this area, which is mainly, steppe or Great Plains, few natural barriers, it's entirely possible one side or the other could achieve a striking victory. I think the next 2 weeks are the weeks in which NATO and the European Union, working with Kiev, and also behind the scenes, I would hope, speaking to Moscow, indicate that there are positive benefits to ending this war, not just punitive sticks for continuing this war. So that would be my message. I think we have a rapidly closing window, because if the war resumes on large scale in the East, I think everything I've said may be overtaken by events.
Grazie per il suo tempo, professor Lynch, grazie a tutti noi che l'abbiamo seguita in sala e attraverso il web, grazie alla Fondazione Campana, grazie ai Trentini nel mondo, grazie a tutti voi che ci avete seguito. Allora ci si sposta ad ascoltare questi rintocchi che oggi assumono un valore ancora più importante. Buona serata a tutti, grazie.
Thank you very much. Grazie, e arrivederci e buona fortuna. E pace. Si vis pacem para pacem.
Ci muoveremo per farla diventare Trentino nel mondo ad onore, ma a questo punto no?
Si può fare.
Si muoverà in tal senso. A presto, grazie ancora.
Quest'estate lo facciamo in presenza.
Una cosa.
Con gran piacere e onore.
Ha già accettato.
Ha già accettato.
Okay.
Perfetto. Beh,
Arrivederci. Bye bye.
Bye.
Thank you, everybody.
Bene, grazie mille.
Thank you, Serena. Thank you. It was brilliant.
Esatto.
Okay. Happy birthday too, by the way.